Welcome back to Maddux Monday. So this week we're going to go into the second part of Reconstruction. We're going to look more at what it was like for the freed men and women after the Civil War and in the South. You are also going to be looking at a white supremacist group that's going to start up during this time called the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. Please, when you're reading it, if you have any questions, please talk to me. You can feel free to email me. You can send a message on Remind or talk to your parents about it. The article about the KKK can get a little intense, and I do understand that. So please talk to someone if it gets too much for you. Just a little warning out there. Another thing we're going to be talking about is the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. As we know, Andrew Johnson will become president after Lincoln is assassinated because he was next in line because he was the vice president. So you have 3 different assignments this week. Make sure you're turning everything in. So if you're done with something, please click the turn in button. That's how you get points. If it is saying missing, that means it has not been turned in. Also, if I return something back to you and it says incomplete, please go back and finish it so you get all those points. Okay, so we're going to get started with this week. It's going to be a little more intense, a little more heavy because we're going to be talking about a lot of racism. Okay, first up. So, after the Civil War, we know some new amendments were added to the Constitution, such as the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery, 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship rights to anyone born in the U.S., and then the 15th Amendment gave voting rights for all men of 21 years or older. Now, as we know, just because there's new laws doesn't mean people are automatically not going to be not racist. As we know, people in our world are still racist today. As we, current events, we had one recently that I'll be posting about later so that we can kind of talk about it a little more in depth. So first thing, one positive thing, Congress started the Freedmen's Bureau. So a bureau means an organization. So just like the FBI, which is the Federal Bureau of Investigation, we have the Freedmen's Bureau, which is going to help out freed men and women get back on their feet, give them jobs, give them clothes, teach them a skill if they need it, teach them to read and write, so that way they can, break this loop of having to only be farmers. So we're going to have Congress stepping in to try to help them out. Now, Andrew Johnson is not going to agree with this, and he's going to fight back against it with the Black Codes, which are strict laws that really encourage racism in the South, which are going to lead to some unfair labor contracts and just really not great world for freed men and women to live in post-Civil War. So one thing that they're going to allow is called sharecropping, which means that you're going to rent land from somebody, usually a plantation owner, and a portion of your crops you're going to give as your rent. Now, as we know, it's not going to be very fair. So for example, I'm just going to throw some numbers out here to help you understand how unfair this was. So for example, if you're growing corn and your landowner requires you to give them 75% of your corn as your rent payment, meaning you get to keep 25%, which is maybe barely enough to survive off of. Now it's not slavery because you are getting to keep some of the profit, but it's not really enough to, maybe feed your family off of and buy other groceries and stuff like that, or clothes or something like that. So it's going to keep them in this cycle of poverty. Now, the Black Codes are going to turn into what are called the Jim Crow laws, which is going to allow legal segregation. So I have included a picture here, like restrooms, for example. You'll have the colored restrooms and the white restrooms. Now, you might remember a famous story about segregation from a little lady named Rosa Parks, where she was not allowed to sit anywhere she wanted on the bus, and she had to give up her seat because of these Jim Crow laws of segregation. So that's what it's going to be like in the South. A lot of freed men and women are going to say that this new Black Codes, Jim Crow laws, all of these are going to be worse than slavery because they're going to allow such violent activities such as lynching, which is public hangings. And we're going to get groups like the KKK pop up during this. Now, another way for different, southern states to kind of fight back against these new amendments was to make voting restrictions. So yes, they legally had to allow people to vote who were male of the age of 21, but they're going to make some obstacles to make it a little more difficult for them. So first of all, they're going to require a poll tax, which means you have to pay in order to vote. Now, if you look at that sharecropping situation, if you're not making a whole lot of money for groceries and clothing for your children, do you think you're going to have enough money to go vote? Well, technically, legally, you're allowed to, but you just have to pay to do it. So another hurdle they're going to give them is a literacy test, which is a reading test that they're going to give to make sure, what they were saying was, well, if you can't read, you can't vote. And, there was they thought that, if you're a freed slave, you never learned to read. But we know that's not always true. So they're going to give this test. It's like the impossible test. There's these questions on it that are very difficult. And I have included an example right here. Like one of the questions on the test is, in the first circle below, write the last letter of the first word beginning with L. So you're like, what is it even talking about? This is more than just, can you read this paragraph and answer questions? And the rules for it were you had 10 minutes to answer 30 questions, and if you get one wrong, it's an automatic fail. So they were finding that some white men couldn't pass this test and weren't all the way literate. So then they brought in what's called the grandfather clause. It's not Santa Claus's grandfather. So what it was, if your grandfather could vote and have records of them voting before the Civil War, then you didn't have to take the literacy test because it was too hard for a lot of them to pass. So basically it meant if you're white, you don't have to take the test if you can prove your grandfather voted before the Civil War, which if you were a slave, you weren't allowed to vote. So Black men couldn't, show that. So another hurdle here for these southern states to kind of backlash at those new amendments that were passed. So lots of racism, very, very sad and heartbreaking, and how, they finally got their freedom, but they're not going to be respected still. Very long road ahead of them. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about Andrew Johnson, who was okay with the black codes and the poll tax and the literacy test. So Congress is not going to be okay with Andrew Johnson. So Congress wanted to figure out a way to get rid of Andrew Johnson, but they had to do it, following the Constitution. So what they did, Congress came out with a new law called the Tenure of Office Act, which means you cannot fire someone in the cabinet, which we know the presidential advisors or any of those type of positions like department heads and stuff, without Congress's permission. Now, Johnson and Congress did not get along at all. Johnson kept vetoing the different things that Congress was trying to do to help the freed slaves. And he would veto it and then come out with more, racist laws against them, basically. So Congress was like, you know what, we are done. We don't get along at all. So they brought in the Tenure of Office Act. Now, knowing that Johnson didn't like a lot of the cabinet members that Lincoln picked, he was trying to get rid of them. So with the Tenure of Office Act, he'd have to ask Congress's permission to fire them. So what does he do? He fires one of them without their permission. So the Congress is like, gotcha. So next moves on to the impeachment trial. So as we know, House of Representatives brings, writes up the charges, and then the Senate tries it. Now, in the Senate, it was one vote away from being removed from office. So as we know, impeachment, just like we saw with Trump, is the charges in the trial. And then if they find you guilty, you can get removed from office. Now, Johnson, very close here. One vote. Guy was carried in on a stretcher. He was so sick. And they didn't think he was going to show up. But he did. He was there. And he was the one that, was that close, almost tiebreaker vote there. So, Andrew Johnson got to keep being president. But think of that awkward moment the next time he meets with Congress going, hey, you guys tried to fire me. I'm still here. Let's try to agree on something to help the U.S. amend from the Civil War. So, because of that, he did not get reelected for a second term. We get Ulysses S. Grant next, who, as we know, is a Civil War hero. So I hope this helps. Remember, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And I will talk to you guys later. Make sure to click the turn in button.